Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Louis Vincent Gave. Hopefully I've met a number of you over the past few years. Or over the past few weeks worth of Zoom calls. My guess is by now all of you are very familiar with the various Zoom functions, but to rehash, if you have any questions, and we do welcome questions, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. There's a Q&A function and a chat function. If possible, please use the Q&A function. I'll be monitoring that function throughout this call and basically either answering the questions directly or pitching the questions to DJ as they come in. So again, the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen for any questions that you might have. So the topic of today's Zoom call is, as announced, the path of progression of COVID-19. Now, I think, over the past few weeks, the temptation for most investors, most analysts, has been to become amateur epidemiologists. We've tried to shy away from that, of course. We don't have any particular training nor insights on how diseases progress. Having said that, we also have been building over the past few years a deep quant team based in Paris, headed by Didier Darcet. Some of you I know have met Didier over the years to talk about the quant work of our Paris team, specifically, basically focused around building new portfolio construction rules, which has been the key focus of most of Charles's career. So Charles, having moved back to Paris, teamed up with Didier, and together they produced actually some very interesting work. And if you want to be on the research list of what our quant team does, it's a separate product, and you should you can contact me, contact your GAFCAL sales guy, and it's very interesting work. When it comes down to this virus, our quant team has actually teamed up with two universities, the Zurich Polytechnique and in Switzerland, and the Shenzhen University of Science and Technology in southern China. Together, they've already published 2 academic papers. A third is right now under review. We've sent, of course, these academic papers to all of you, and hopefully you've received them. If you have them, again, don't hesitate to contact us, and we'll send them on. To basically look at the progression of this disease through a purely quant lens. Today, this is why we asked Didier to present. Didier made this presentation last week at our French seminar for our French-speaking clients, and there was great feedback on it. And I thought, okay, this is actually the findings around the progression of this disease are interesting enough that really everybody should be aware of this. So that's really the topic of this call today, is taking a quant eye to the progression of COVID-19. But I've spoken enough. Let me pass on the microphone to Didier, who will go through some, what I think are fascinating facts about the progression of this disease, where we've been, where we're likely heading. And again, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Thank you very much. À toi, Didier.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me share my screen. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for joining the webinar. So the question is, where do we stand today on the epidemic from a statistical standpoint? And I'll start with something that we realized here is that we seem to be all in agreement. And I say that because by talking to family and friends about government measures, lockdowns, social distancing, etc. And I say that as well because we found a study done by the University of Dublin. It's not a study, in fact, it's an online poll voluntary that they did on the 8th of April. And they had about 100,000 responses. And the question was the degree of, the approval of government measures. And you can see on the slide that, social distancing, lockdown, no travel, shops locked down, so they received a very high level of approval, like 80 to 90%. So all is good, all is in agreement. We are all in agreement. The second thing I wanted to stress is the notion of responsibility of the scientists. And a week ago, there was an interview in the French radio of a very well-known scientist. He's a nuclear physicist. His name is Etienne Klein. And he was asked this question: what are the responsibilities of a scientist? And his answer was, if you're a scientist, you have to tell what you know, and you have to tell what you don't know. So what does it mean for us? For us, it means something simple, is that for about 3 months, we've been publishing numerous papers, but we, of course, listen to what everybody says. We study different things, but everything we publish comes from us. So we don't know whether it's the best research, but you can be sure of one thing, that it's an independent research. And when I say it comes from us, it means GAFCAL, and as Louis was mentioning, it means as well the 2 universities, and chaired by Professor Didier Sornet, that I want to thank, because we entered into a partnership with them in December last year, and this partnership is ongoing, very live, and we talk to each other on a daily basis. About the question of what you don't know, for instance, we know that there are different kinds of flus. There are seasonal flus and there are non-seasonal flus. And why are they seasonal flus? We don't know. And we don't know that for more than 200 years. The first statistics that we got in France, for example, date back to the French Revolution. So for 200 years, people have analyzed why they are seasonal flus, because of humidity, because of temperature. But at the end of the day, we don't know. But the fact that there are 2 types of flus is interesting, because at the very beginning of the epidemic in China, so I'm talking about January, the epidemic started exponentially. And it was extremely scary, because at the original pace, about half of the humanity would have been infected within less than 2 or 3 months. So that was very serious. But then by the end of Jan, we realized that the exponential dynamic was fading. And so we started publishing 1st of Feb, saying it might not be as horrible as people might have feared. And it may be something like a seasonal epidemic. Another thing is the notion of wisdom of crowd. In 2018 or 2008, I think, James Surowiecki wrote this book. It's a very good book, where he's basically is saying that very often, in various circumstances, the many are smarter than the few. In other words, the common opinion is much better than the opinion of specialists. So he took an example, a funny one. He took a glass recipient, a jar, and he filled it with Smarties, this little chocolate candies with different colors, so thousands of them. And he went to an airport and he asked the people dropping by how many Smarties there were in the jar. And he recorded all that. And at the end of the day, he calculated the average opinion, and he realized that the average opinion was incredibly close to the exact number of Smarties in the jar. So the conclusion is that if we are all in agreement and the crowd is wise, we are in the best situation. But there is an if, and the if is the following one. It's the fact that all that works well, the crowd is wise as long as people don't talk too much to each other. When people start talking, exchanging opinions, they influence each other. And when they influence each other, up to a certain extent, the crowd can turn from wise to crazy. We all know that in finance, when we see big crashes, big drawdowns, fear and greed, all these things, which can propose the market far out of equilibrium. So we did a study, a model, computer model in 2018, And we basically took 100 participants and we allowed them to express binary opinions, such as -1 or +1. And then we calculated the average opinion. So the average opinion between -1 and +1 was, of course, 0. Not exactly 0 because there were random drawings. So sometimes it was +0.10, -0.15, but that was, of course, more or less the response of the system. And then we introduced a new factor, the fact that maybe the opinion of any participant could be influenced by other. So for instance, we said, let's take a factor 20%. So we assumed that the opinion of any participant would be weighted the following way: 20% the average opinion of others, and 80%, he or her own idiosyncratic opinion. And then we ran the program again and moved this parameter. And you see the result, which is on the graph below. And the result is quite interesting, because what you see is that from a factor of mutual influence, which goes from 0 to 20%, 40%, etc., up to 80%, nothing happens. So it means that at 80%, people are influencing each other a lot, but the global response is still the same, close to 0, with low fluctuations. But if you cross a certain threshold, which is 80% in this case, then something changes. It means the response of the system becomes completely wild, very far out of equilibrium. The answer becomes +0.9 or -0.75, and it flips. So the conclusion is that if we are below these thresholds, it means the crowd is wise and everything is fine. But if by any chance we have crossed these thresholds, so that the common opinion comes from a deep mutual influence, then it's very dangerous. And it's very dangerous for two reasons. The first one is that the common opinion could be far out of equilibrium. It means it could be very far from reality. And the second risk is that this opinion could flip, because when you are in these tails, it's like in finance, in the tails of the distribution, opinions flips. So if everybody agrees on A today, they could well agree on B tomorrow. And of course, this could have important social or political consequences. So how did we track the pandemic? So we've done very sophisticated methods with the Professor Sarnet, but the basis of our first calculation was the following. First, we said we have to watch the number of deaths, not the number of cases, simply because each country has its own way to measure cases. So death is not perfect, but it's more stable as a parameter. Second, we have to compare the epidemics at start. And that looks very logical. But I remember that the early stage of the epidemics in France, the press was saying that Italy was horrible, was dreadful, and France was wonderful. But it didn't make any sense because France was lagging by about 2 weeks. So you have to rescale all that. The third thing, of course, we have to normalize the number of deaths by country population. And once we've done that, then we have trajectories between, across countries, and we can compare the countries. And we have to verify the fading of the jolts. And what is the jolt? The jolt is not the speed, it's not the acceleration, it's one step further, it's the speed of the acceleration. And why do we have to move one step further? It's simply because an epidemic is exponential by nature. They start with one infected person, that infects 2, then 4, etc., 8, 16. So it's exponential by nature. And we know very well what it means in finance. If you have a constant interest rates, it leads to an exponential growth in price. If you want to look at the S&P, for instance, for the last 120 years, and you take a linear scale, you will see a superb exponential. But you won't be able to analyze the S&P because the crisis of 1928 will look so small. So what do? We change the scale, and instead of taking a linear scale, we turn it into a log scale. And when we turn it into a log scale, what happens is that the exponential becomes a straight line, and then we can see the oscillations around this straight line. And these oscillations are the jolt. So the question was to look at this oscillation and to verify that they were fading. And that is the results. So when you look back across 42 countries, you have here the average jolts and the standard deviation. And what do you see? You see that initially the death compounded at around 30% per day death rate, which is huge. It means that 30% per day, it could have been dramatic over a very short period of time. But at the same time, we saw that the jolt started fading, and it faded. We wanted to fit it with an exponential, and it seems to work quite well. And since then, it has been fading nicely around this exponential. So now we're not compounding at 30% per day, but something like 2 or 3%. Once we've done that, then we can look at the trajectories. So we have here log scales. Don't look at the numbers because there are so many normalization factors there by the country population, by, of course, the same starting date. And we as well normalize to make sure that they all started with one case. So it doesn't matter the left side. What you see is the trajectories. And first thing, they look all of them look very much the same. It means that you have a nice fading of the jolts. Second thing that we see is that you have basically three groups of countries. You have on the bottom of the graph, you have Southeast Asia and Africa, which have done well. The middle part of the graph, you have basically East Europe, Latin America, Greece, which have suffered a bit more. And the upper side of the graph are the countries which have suffered the most from the epidemics. And it's West Europe and the US. And from the bottom group to the up group, there's a factor 100. So this is quite significant. Despite that, you can see that if you prolong this curve, the final death as a percentage of the population is anticipated to reach something like 0.05% of the population, which is of course a number, but it's not a huge number. Quick zoom on West Europe and the US. So West Europe and the US is interesting. It's the worst zone. So what do you see? You see that Belgium has done not that well. It's in yellow, but it's probably because Belgium, the way Belgium records the number of deaths is a lot stricter than in other countries. So it may come from this effect. Spain has done worse on top, but it's fading more rapidly. So it starts converging towards Italy. Germany has done a lot better. And there's a lot of discussions about that and studies. But when you see the other countries, so the US, the UK, France, Netherlands, Sweden, they are very, very similar. In other words, if I were to take out the legends, so you would not see the name of the countries, and I were to ask you which country is which, you would be in deep trouble. And I would even go one step further, which is to say, take the curve of the US, for instance, or France. And I ask you, when do you think the lockdown took place? And you will be as well in deep trouble to answer the question, because the fading of the jolt has been very, very smooth. Is the worst yet to come? I asked this question because there was a publication from a French institute, Institut Pasteur, a week ago, and he was saying the worst was yet to come. And this was a very strange statement, I thought, and non-scientific, because of course there could be a second wave. But today we don't see any second wave coming. There's no indication of a second wave. So what does it mean is the worst yet to come? From what we know today, no. From what we know today, we have passed the peak in many, many countries and on a worldwide basis as well. So 2 to 3 weeks ago, we published a note which was titled Timing the Peaks. And the concept was simple. We said they look very much similar in Europe, the trajectories, and Italy is in advance. So we can have a chance that we can project the likely peak of all these countries. And our conclusion was that by the 20th of April, all these countries would have passed the peaks. And you see that the peak on a worldwide basis happened not on the 20th, but on the 17th of April. So this is good news. Why do we have discrepancies between countries? There are a lot of studies on that. It's extremely difficult. So there's an obvious factor, which is life expectancy. We know that the elder people suffered more, a lot more from the epidemic. So you have a graph here where you have the deaths per million on the y-axis and you have the life expectancy on the x-axis. And you see, of course, that there's a correlation between the deaths per million and the age of the population or its life expectancy. Another factor, which is a lot more debated, is the BCG vaccine. Why? Because we realize that there might be a correlation. You see on green, all the countries which have regular BCG vaccination campaigns, and on pink and red, the one either who never had such campaigns or have abandoned these campaigns. And there seem to be some sort of clustering between the countries, even though Australia, which is on the bottom, is a very strange thing. Key figures. First thing, within the worst zone in Europe, which is, say, France, the final mortality rate is anticipated to be in the region of 0.05% of the population. And that means for France about 30,000 deaths. So 30,000 deaths, it's both a lot and not a lot. Not a lot, why? Because in France, we have about 600,000 natural deaths per year. So it's just 20 times less. We believe that the minimum of 20% of the population has been infected. In fact, in France, we see that a lot of companies, private companies, are asking their employees to go and be tested for antibodies, and they do that. And I had a chance to talk with them, and their result is about in the region of 28–30%. So it means that the mortality rates will be close to a seasonal flu. Our anticipation is that it's going to be within 0.1% to 0.2% of the people infected, which is very standard, which is the type of lethality that we find on seasonal flus. The difference is that this COVID is about 3 times more contagious. Some other key figures, but not in France, but in another zone which has been suffered a lot in the US, New York. And New York, I think, counted something like more than a third of the total deaths in the US. So what do we see? We see that first, the fatality rate, if infected, depends on your age. Less than 18 years old, 0. Between 18 and 45 years old, 0.01%, so extremely small. Above 75 years old, you get close to 1%. On average, the conclusion from the Stanford antibody study was that the average fatality rate would be between 0.1 and 0.2%. So we are very, very much in line. But there's another thing that they published, which is interesting, is that it's a question of what is killing the people who die from the COVID. Is that the COVID or is that something else? And in fact, when people have another disease associated with COVID, then the lethality rate jumps to the roof. So they looked at a sample of 6,500 deaths that they investigated, and they noticed that a huge number of them, 99.2%, came from comorbidity cases, which means from people who had 2 diseases, one first and then the COVID. So it means that it's not really age, which was the problem. It was the fact that aging or overweight leads to certain sorts of disease, which then leads when they are associated to death. What are the lessons for the future? First lesson is that there will be a lot of temptation to focus on exogenous responses, such as the BCG, such as inventing a new vaccine. But fair enough, but a flu vaccine, we know that sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work. If the virus mutates, then it doesn't work. The average success today is between 50% and 80%, so it varies. Other types of exogenous responses, nicotine, for example. They realized that about a smoker had something like 2 or 3 times less chance to be infected. But, okay, I hope they will not recommend everybody to smoke. But this is not the only type of response. The second type of response that should be very, very important are the endogenous responses. And there are two types of endogenous responses. The first one is the notion of personal resilience, lifestyle, food, the way the transportation, all these things will have a tremendous impact in the future if people realize that they can try and find resilience within their own life. And the second level of resilience is cultural, and it's linked to the notion of risk appetite. Why is that? Because, okay, in France, we will have something like 30,000 deaths. But if we look back to 1957, for instance, we had in France something like between 50,000 and 100,000 deaths. This time we're targeting 30,000. So it was much, much worse, and nothing happened. In 1969, we had another flu coming from Hong Kong, same thing, 35,000 deaths in 3 weeks, and nothing happened. So what has fundamentally changed? What has fundamentally changed between now and then? I think two things. The first is that at the time, the radio and the television were under the control of governments, and governments, of course, they don't want to frighten the public. But there's another thing, is that at the time in 1969, our fellow Americans, they were sending cosmonauts to walk upon the moon. And I don't know if you had the chance to see an Apollo landing station, but it's amazing. It looks like a sardine can. And if you open it, if you look at the electronics inside, it very much looks like the good old pinball game of the 70s. It's full of wires everywhere. But they took the risk and they went there 300,000 kilometers from the Earth. So what has fundamentally changed is the risk appetite. And this leads me to my conclusion, which is the notion of fragility. We've studied a lot this notion of fragility and anti-fragility in the last 2 years. And fragility is basically the loss divided by the stress. So it means that an object, a society, an asset, which reacts very badly to a little bit of stress and loses a lot, is very fragile. And I think that our rich countries, Western countries, have shown a high level of fragility in these circumstances. And probably within 20 to 30 years, when historians will look back at this period, they will very likely consider factors such as cultural factors, fragility, risk appetite, but they will not analyze scientific factors. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Muted. Sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much, Didier. Great presentation. I've got a couple questions. I've got questions of my own, but I'll ask other people's first. One question was, INSERM in France says the infected proportion is 5.8%, well below the 20% you mentioned. How do you feel so confident that already 20% of people in France have had this?
At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. What matters is the number of deaths. So the number of deaths is, of course, the lethality multiplied by the number of people. We think from different sources in different countries that it varies between 15 and 20%. And again, we had this example that comes out from the private sector. Now, this is not a key figure. For example, the INSERM says 5.8%. Institut Pasteur says 15% or 10%. So everybody has his own way of calculating. We calculate that across countries, and our conclusion from what we can see is a lot more than that. And history will tell. But at the end of the day, it's the number of deaths which counts. So this is not a central or key figure, I would say.
Okay, thanks Didier. A question on the concept of herd immunity. We've all heard about how if enough people get contaminated, then basically the virus doesn't find new bodies a virus to spread needs bodies to spread it. And if enough people have built immunity, then all of a sudden, if enough people can no longer be carriers, there's a better odds of the virus dying out. This is obviously what Sweden is betting on. To some extent, other countries like Japan that have taken far more modest measures. Do you believe in that concept of herd immunity, or does it make little sense statistically?
No, of course. No, it's a very serious thing. And to be honest, when the epidemic started, at least in Europe, I noticed something very strange, is that there were two types of reaction. You had basically the Protestant type of reaction and the Catholic type of reaction. Protestant, I mean, just before all these government measures had been implemented. So you had countries like the UK, the US, Sweden, Switzerland, they were not very happy about the idea of locking people. It was more the Catholic who did that. And the reason probably has to do with their, the relation to money and the relation to the states. And in Germany, there were a lot of discussions as well. Angela Merkel was very, very uncomfortable to do lockdowns because she comes from a country where freedom was hard to gain. So the question of immunity, yes, it's an important point. The countries which have not locked down are in a better position. Because now the countries which have done lockdown are going to face the consequences of maybe insufficient transmission of the virus, which is not sure. But if it's the case, it may last longer to reach immunity. And when we realize that at the end of the day, you had a small population, because 92% of the cases who died exhibited comorbidity. So it means that the population which was at risk was very, very much at risk. But the rest of the population was not. It was spreading faster than the flu, but it's not going to end as something more in terms of mortality than a normal flu. So it makes sense. It made sense to a certain extent to let the flu spread and to reach this immunity so that the population would be immune. And that probably would have been as well better for the fragile population. But that's just an opinion. But scientifically, yes, of course. Either the COVID-19 just died by itself because it's seasonal. But if not, or if it takes longer, it's better to reach levels such as up to 60% of the population infected, and then there's no consequences, no spreading anymore.
So you mentioned that you don't really believe in the concept of a second wave, but at the same time you believe in the concept of herd immunity. But so it can be said, look, if there is going to be a second wave, then a country like Sweden or Japan that have not really done lockdowns are much better positioned for the future. And the countries that have done lockdowns could end up with both a much worse economic outcome, which is fairly obvious at this point, and at the same time, actually a worse human outcome and disease outcome if you do get a second wave.
No, I agree. I don't say that I don't believe in a second wave. What I'm saying is that when you have people making decisions on that base and asking scientists to give an opinion on the basis of statistics, we would see the beginning of a second wave if the jolt started to grow and not fading continuously. So as of today, we can't say that there is any sort of second wave coming. Maybe 3 weeks down the road, I don't know. We look at that, everybody looks at that day by day. But your conclusion is correct. It means that if there is a second wave, the population which have been more infected than others will be in a much better situation, of course.
Okay, I've got questions coming in thick and fast. On the question of the BCG, I think that typically, if I remember from the shot I got when I was at school, how long? I think the effect is supposed to last about 10 years, right? Maybe I'm wrong, but I think the effect is supposed to last about 10 years. And yes, you've had a lot of countries, especially in Western Europe, that used to do this. So I got the BCG when I was a kid, but they don't do it to my kids. Is this a spurious correlation? Or do you put faith in this BCG vaccine? Do you think it's for real, or do you think it's scientists looking for anything to, or is it basically scratching at the bottom of the barrel for potential explanations?
Yeah, we can't say anything about that because this is just a correlation. So there could be, third factors. So there may be no relation in terms of cause and effect. Maybe it's spurious. So this is why I said, possible something to look at. Not sure at all. The only thing I read about, but I'm not a doctor, is that it's not the direct effect of the BCG. It's the possible indirect effect of the BCG, which has some sort of anti-parasitic virtues, just like nicotine. You see, so, but I'm not a doctor. I don't know. I would not, put my head on make huge risk on saying that this is true. It's just looking at various parameters. There are a very limited number of parameters that seems to explain the discrepancies between the various countries, and this one might be something to look at in the future. But making political decisions on that would require a lot more studies, I guess.
So there's a question from Rodolfo, who's asking that if there's been different articles in the FT, the Economist, Nassim Taleb's done a few tweets on this, looking at the total deaths per country, and there was an especially interesting study in the Economist last week on this, and it seems that the deaths per country is more than what we would expect relative to previous years, and hereby raising the question of whether there could be a serious undercounting of deaths due to COVID. So of course, I guess for your models, you're using the data that we get from the WHO or wherever else on the official deaths for COVID, but isn't there a risk that those are massively undercounted, and therefore that whatever models we put together aren't really relevant if the data is not relevant?
We looked at that. This notion of excess death as compared to recorded deaths by the COVID. And yes, there could be something like 20 or so 30%. It's not huge, but there could be differences, and it varies from one country to another. One explanation as well is that when on this publication that we read, is that they did not account for the 3-day lag between the two data series. And if you discount the 3-day lag, then you come back to something which is almost in existence. So I have doubts on this explanation. It has to be studied a lot more, and at least normalized by the lag effect, which has not been done, despite the fact that they mention it. They mentioned that there's a lag and that it could have consequences on the data. And when my friends at the ETH looked at that, and they said, okay, if you account for it, the effect is so small. It's much, much smaller.
Great, thank you. Another question from Martin. In your charts, one of the things that stands out, and there's been articles written about this, etc., how basically Australia and New Zealand have had much weaker propagation than other Western countries. And it may be because less population density, although people who live in Australia, although the country's huge, tend to live still in fairly condensed areas in the cities like Melbourne and Sydney, etc. So with that in mind, do you think, of course, the big difference between Australia and Europe and North America, one of the big differences is they're in their summertime right now. We're in our wintertime, they're in their summertime. So do you think the difference could be related to the weather?
Yeah, it's probably the discriminating factor more than the density, because you look, for example, the density of the US as compared to Netherlands. It's just massively different, and the curve are almost the same. So the density of population in a country, I don't think I checked that, doesn't show anything. The fact that, of course, we're not in the same season might have an effect, especially because it's a seasonal flu. So that would be the first factor, I would say.
I have, you know, if I can, I have another pet theory that that I've written a little bit about. But you know, I'm doing this call right now from just outside of Vancouver, in British Columbia, and where I have a house. And you know, Vancouver has more flights as a Western country. Vancouver as a Western city, Vancouver has more flights to China than any other Western city. So when this started, my feeling was, you know, Vancouver is going to get hit hard. And in fact, one of the very first COVID cases recorded outside of China were recorded in Toronto and in Vancouver, because there's so many links between Toronto, Vancouver, and China. In fact, you know, most people call Vancouver Hongcouver now. Now, interestingly, if you look at British Columbia, we've only had 76 deaths, and the median age of the deaths here in British Columbia has been 86 years old. So, you know, the disease hasn't had at all that negative an impact on that you might have expected on British Columbia, given the ties. And I'm highlighting that because with the link with Australia, I wonder to the extent, and you know, of course, you can look at Hong Kong with only 4 deaths, Singapore with only 3 deaths. I think Korea's had about 120. Japan's had about 150, even though everybody in Japan is like 150 years old. You know, I wonder to what extent what we had in Asia was a different level of immunity and perhaps herd immunity to this disease than we've had in the Western world. You know, obviously in Asia we were exposed to SARS, we're exposed to other COVIDs. So, you know, perhaps the reason it hasn't been as deadly in Asia as it's been in Europe and in North America is very different levels of already embedded immunity in the population when this hit. And perhaps Australia, because it has a lot of links with Asia, perhaps British Columbia, because it has a lot of links with Asia, also benefited from this very high level of herd immunity. Do you think that makes sense or not really?
No, I think it's a possibility. Is that genetic? I would doubt, but it could come from, you know, the history of the population. You know, all the big epidemic of Europe since the 14th century, they are coming from this part of the world because they don't live in the same conditions. So they don't react. Their body does not react to the same type of stresses. And when we Europeans we went to America. With our own disease, then we killed all the Americans. I think that about 200 million people died on the continent, and not because they were killed, you know, with knives, and mostly because of disease. So when you have a population that are in different environments, with animals and different, you know, type of course, situation, then the disease changes. So they can have some sort of immunity against that sort of virus and not against other sorts of viruses. So yes, that's a possible explanation.
And another question. Sorry.
Let me add just one thing, is that now with all these things, we're saying today, it's okay, the old people mostly the old people died from this. And it's worrying because in 20 or 30 years time down the road, there will be the elderly population will be much, much bigger. So if we have a flu, let's say 10 or 20 years down the road like this, it's going to be much worse. Now there's so many things that we don't know. I will get back to my second slide. So for example, the question you asked, yeah, it's something to study, but we don't really know that. And my point was as well that in 1969 in France, when we had 30,000 people dying, the people who were dying were not the old people, they were the young people. So this is, you see, so if we react and we do everything we can to protect against the next epidemic, the virus may mute or may be different. There are many, many things that we don't know.
So is the risk, to your point, now that we've done this, is the risk that, you know, the next winter when somebody sneezes, and is that we go, is this lockdown going to become a regular event? Partly because, as you point out, as our societies age, if the view is, oh, we have to protect our old people at all cost, especially our old voters at all cost, are we going to do this over and over and over again?
I was yesterday buying, potatoes and vegetable down the road. And the guys there, I said, okay, on the 11th of May, this is the end of the lockdown in France, so it's going to be loosened progressively. And he told me it will not change anything. What will happen is that you will not have a paper in your pocket explaining why you are going out of your house or your apartment in case the police ask you why you're doing so. But that would be that would be exactly the same. People would go out, would of course maintain social distancing. Some people will keep masks. We're not going to change overnight because this is over. And that will last. How long it will last, I don't know. But I'm sure that it's going to be, there will be tail events on that in terms of personal way of interacting socially.
Well, so that brings me to one of the questions here posed by Christos, which is, at what point or event do we cross the Rubicon and accept that, this has been an overinflated health risk? Or is it the case that, our policymakers haven't driven our economies into the ground, while others like Sweden and Japan haven't, and Sweden and Japan aren't faring any worse than anybody else. Politically, it's just too devastating for them to say we messed up. And so we end up with measures forever because, this thing has got to keep getting propped up as this big drama, because if we don't prop it up as a big drama, the political cost of this will be devastating.
Yeah, that's the big risk. I think it's the first time in history that humanity, decided for itself or gave itself the mission to save everybody. And of course, it's a very nice thing to try and do, but it doesn't make any sense either. So the question is, of course, the risk rewards, the risk appetites, all these notions that are changing over time. And in this case, obviously, the expectation were tremendously high, probably under the pressure of the situation, because some people were going to hospitals and the hospitals had, too many cases and they didn't really know how to cure them. And that created some sort of panic. And so I'm not saying that there was no panic or there was any reason to be concerned. But what I see, for instance, in France is that we know now for quite, a certain number of days, if not weeks, that it is fading. It is fading quickly, and we have example of other countries. And despite that, the loosening of the lockdown is pushed forward. And when you talk to people in Switzerland, for example, they just laugh because they have not been locked like us. They will end up, with small losses, something like probably 4 or 5 times less than us, and with no more death per capita than us. So I don't know how the opinion will evolve, but we are a very small minority of people saying these things today. I would say that 90% say the opposite, that it was right to do that, and if it happens again, we should do it again. I'm not sure of it.
But isn't there, to your point, have we just not witnessed a massive change in the goalposts? Because if you look through the history of COVID, first Wuhan locks down because the healthcare system is overwhelmed. Then Lombardia locks down because the health system is overwhelmed. And then basically most of Western Europe locks down because out of a fear, the rationale is we want to make sure that our health systems are not overwhelmed. You remember all the posters of the nice doctors and nurses with saying, I go to work, but you have to stay at home. I go to work for you, so please stay at home for me, and all that stuff. So the rationale for locking down our economies was to avoid the overwhelming of our healthcare systems. And in Eastern France for a while it was touch and go, and in New York for a while it was touch and go. But now pretty much nowhere around the world are the health systems being overwhelmed. And yet the lockdowns are still on because the goals have been shifted to we must prevent deaths.
Yeah.
But not overwhelming the healthcare system is a pretty measurable goal. You know more or less. Today you have more hospital beds in the UK empty than you did before this crisis started. So that's an easily measurable target. Preventing death it's a non-measurable target. So I guess it's sorry for the rant, but at what point basically will our policymakers decide, okay, now we can open, and is it a jolt of zero?
No, I would say that it's very, very difficult to blame people for making tough decisions like that. At a certain point in time, maybe they didn't know, or etc. But what I see that there are some people adapting fast, and some people or some countries and others which are not adapting. And I think it's a mistake not to adapt, and probably for the political reason that you mentioned, which is it's very difficult to step back when you have basically made decisions that are going to decrease the GDP by 10%, with all the consequences, the future consequences on that. And not only in terms of money in your pocket, but in terms of funding hospitals in the future, because you can't have a good a health system, if you don't have enough money. So all that is linked. And we have plenty of surgeries, for example, which have been postponed. In France, for example, there is no, heart attack anymore, apparently, for 3 months. So what happened? The people had their heart attack at home. They didn't go to the hospital. So there are plenty of things around that have not been counted yet. And I think that it's one thing to make a mistake or but it's another thing not to adjust to the previous mistakes and react promptly to do something. It seems that a lot of countries are, not a lot, but some countries are frozen in their reaction today. And this is the type of thing that I'm intellectually challenging.
So on this question of when does it all end, the rise in cases dictated the shutdown actions. You had the big rise in cases, and indeed people feared, the health systems are going to be overwhelmed. So it dictated the shutdown actions. Now cases are fewer, even if the mortality is higher. Now, is the fall in mortality, which in a lot of countries are now starting to see, that should be the driver for the end of the shutdown. And first, do you agree with that? And secondly, that means we should have an end of the shutdown pretty soon.
Yes, and I think that there's something we know that we didn't know before, is the vulnerable population. We know it very, very precisely now. So it's not like everybody is at risk, so don't go out because you could cross your neighbor and be in deep trouble. This is not true. There's a very small, limited population which is very much at risk. So I think that once you know that, you can make political decisions on that base, and probably for the next one as well. This is to identify these people and to make sure that there's a huge lockdowns around these people and a huge service and health service around these people. But saying that we should, make the same decision for these people and for the rest of the population is a complete different story. Because as I said, if you are, under 18, your risk is 0. 50% of the cases of the people who had it did not even know they had it. They had little symptoms. They were basically asymptomatic. So, this is why as well, I think that the percentage of the population which has been infected is a lot larger than these people say when they say 5% or 6%. No, a lot of people had it. And probably when you ask around you, say, did you think you had the COVID? Then people start to talk, say, yeah, probably had it. Until they're going to be tested and it will be confirmed.
So one of the questions, that's probably because you're talking to French people and they're all hypochondriacs. But you say, if you say it's like, I have an answer for this one, but the question is, you say this is like the flu, but how do you account and manage for the surge in demand for ventilators and overwhelming the healthcare system in the short term. Here, I want to make a quick point, because I think something very interesting has happened in amongst this thing is that, by and large, the healthcare systems that were centralized, if you think Italy, France, the UK, those were the ones that tended to be overwhelmed. If you think of the healthcare systems that were broadly decentralized, Canada, Switzerland, Germany, Sweden, those were the ones that by and large fared fine. The one big exception, of course, is the United States. The United States, the healthcare system is decentralized. And New York was very touch and go for a while, and New York looked like it was overwhelmed. So New York, I guess, is kind of the exception that confirms the rule, but perhaps for New York, there's specific explanations, linked to the subway being a petri dish of germ transmission, people living on top of each other. And it seems that, frankly, in New York, most of the cases and most of the deaths seem to have happened in Queens, where perhaps sanitary conditions just aren't that great. So when you look at the overwhelming of the healthcare systems, I think there's really been, so you've had Wuhan. Here you could say, well, China's still a third world country and its healthcare system probably isn't where it should be. You've had Northern Italy, where perhaps there's been too many government cuts. You've had Eastern France, and you've had New York in terms of being overwhelmed. And I think when you look at France, you look at Italy, frankly, the preparation to the pandemic was pathetic. No masks, no gloves, no goggles, no tests. And I say this as an owner of a French rugby team, where we're being told by the French government that we won't be allowed to play rugby again until we can have every player tested before every game. And there won't be enough tests to do that until probably January. Why? Because we have centralized purchasing. If you look in France, the divergence between the performance of the centralized system and basically the private clinic run by Professor Raoult in Marseille, it's shocking. Raoult was prepared for this. He had the gloves, he had the goggles, he had the tests, he had the drugs, and the centralized system didn't. So I think the long-winded answer and a bit of a soapbox answer to your question, but is the failure and the overwhelming of the healthcare systems. When you compare Switzerland, Germany, Sweden to, say, France, Italy, is it just bad luck? Is it linked to the disease itself, or is it linked to a systemic problem within the healthcare systems? Not the disease basically exposed the weakness of our healthcare systems.
I would agree with that. I had an example that was a month and a half ago. I have a friend who lives in London, and he was there, and one of his friends said, okay, I have 50 million masks that are coming from China, and I'm trying to sell them. Can you help me, because you're French, and maybe, I've heard that the French system needed masks. We didn't have enough masks. So he took his phone, he started calling, and then he realized that the Ministry of Health in France had decided that private trade of masks was prohibited. So you could not sell. You had to sell, if you wanted to sell that, you had to sell to the government, basically. So he took his phone, called day after day, sent mails, etc. And after a full week, the only answer he got was, thank you, we noticed that you contacted us. And of course, by this time, he had sold his 50 million masks to the UK. So this is the proof that it's too rigid. You can't adapt to that. You're talking about the eastern part of France, which suffered a lot. So there were too many cases. Some of them even went to Germany. Germany helped France for some of these cases on the eastern part of France. But in Occitanie, there were no virus, basically. So there were plenty of beds. But it's just the organization of moving the people from one to the other. And I think the rigidity of the organization is probably a very good explanation to the difficulties to react fast, which is as well very linked to the notion of fragility. Because fragility is usually the case of, over-optimized system that are very weak when any kind of stress happens. And this is exactly what we saw. So something, strange happens, and all the chain of transmission of command, etc., is just dead. So yes, I think that that is going to be a factor, a very important factor. The ability to react. Well, in a crisis time, this is the first virtue, is the ability I was mentioning to adapt before, or to react to the policy. And some countries are able to do that. There's another point, which is the production capacity. Because Germany has not completely killed its production capacity, as we all know. And one of the consequences that they were able to produce a lot of these things that we needed in other countries, but we were not able to do that. So some people would question these things as well. It's incredible that in countries like Italy, Spain, France, etc., we've been unable to produce masks, which is nothing than a piece of paper, right? A bit more sophisticated, but no, this is not high tech, over the course of 2 months. This is just...
Yeah, pretty pathetic. So there's a question from Franklin. You haven't talked a lot about China now, of course, which is, had one of the most radical lockdowns. Is that because, you're not sure you can trust the Chinese data? Is it, yeah, so you haven't meant, China looked like it was first in and first out, but you haven't really mentioned it. Yeah. So
yeah, China, okay, there's a lot of discussions about the reality of their numbers, and it's probably, much, much bigger than it was, announced, because they are controlling the information. Having said that, even if it was, let's say, 10 times or 100 times higher, it's still very small. So that's the first thing. So you can't take China as an example of a disastrous outcome, not at all, even if it's 100 times worse. And the second thing that makes me uncomfortable talking about China specifically is that you have Southern Korea next door, which is a very rich country. And with a very good health system, etc. And they've done as good as China, almost. So, I think the evolution of the virus there, as it's nothing to do with whether the figures were right or wrong. They have been a lot smaller than in the Western world and the US, for sure.
So your point is, if you look at the progression in South Korea, or frankly, Singapore or Hong Kong, etc., or Japan, places where you can trust the figures, the Chinese figures don't look that crazy.
No. And you can multiply them by 10 or 100, they don't look crazy. These are log scales. So log scale, it's, of course, a little change in the direction changes a lot at the end. So for example, we say that in Western Europe and the US, the final death rate will be 0.05% of the population. But in China, it's 100 times less. So even if you multiply by, or even more. So in this region, so even if you multiply by 10 or 100, you're still,
you're back to where the US was.
Still
So one of the points a client, an Australian client just made, on your curve, Australia looked like it was an anomaly, but until the mid 80s, most people in Australia were getting the BCG vaccine. And in the Northern Territories, which obviously has all the tropical diseases, etc., they mostly still do it. So perhaps Australia isn't such an anomaly after all. They're really, most people have had, anybody over 35 years old will have had the BCG in Australia. And it's, given that it's people who are old who die, then you come back to all the old people will have had the BCG in Australia.
Yeah, but maybe that's a possibility. Having said that, on the upper side of the graph, all the red and pink countries that had suffered the most, plenty of them had the BCG, and then this just lapsed. So Australia is more or less like that. So yeah, maybe that's it. But this require a lot more studies.
Yeah, just so you know. Okay, a question from Sir Michael. Say Germany starts to show a second wave. Given your methodology based on death, this may take a long time to see in the jolt and to see it when it comes. In other words, is your jolt model not risking to be late when something new is happening? So yeah, so that's the question. Basically, if we rely on the jolt to make decisions, are we not always going to be a little late? And if a second wave kicks off, are we not going to catch it too late? And by that point, you know, all hell breaks loose.
But you know, maybe. But what other method could you recommend? You know, we need to have. If you want to make projections, you make projections on a certain dynamic. So you need to have some elements of the dynamic in the past and project the continuation of this dynamic. So for example, today we are saying the jolt is fading this way. So we expect the jolt to keep on fading, you know, alongside these lines. And if we start to see the gap growing between the predictions and the reality, then it's going to be an alarm bell. Not exactly when, that's a good question, but that's something which is, you know, a normal thing for any model. So, but this is the thing to look at, I think, which is the gap between the projections of a continuous smoothing of the jolt and the reality, which may turn out to be not happening. And if the gap is increasing, then it's a signal.
I'm just answering a question here. How can we justify, you know, a waiting day-by-day approach to see whether there'll be a second wave, or get enough data in the contract, get enough data on death rates in the context of studying fragility for the last 2 years? The question is this not the equivalent of standing in the spot as a man with a knife charges at you? You know, is basically, are you not, you know, yeah, I guess the question is, you know, how can we justify, you know, waiting for more data when the data means deaths?
I'm not sure I got it, sorry. Say it again, how justify what?
Yeah, I'll read the question. How can you justify the waiting day-by-day approach to see whether there will be a second wave, or to get enough data on the death rates in the context of studying fragility for the last 2 years? It's the equivalent of standing in the spot as a man with a knife charges at you to gather more data on whether he's after the person next to you. So I guess here the point is, the point of the question is, look, you know, as people are dying here, you know, how can we wait for more data to see whether the growth of the death is exponential, or whether it's, you know, it tails off and isn't that big a deal after all? So, you know, I guess the point is our policymakers really had no choice to go on lockdown because it was exponential at the beginning and it was so scary that really they had to be seen to be doing something.
Yeah, it's an opinion. I would say that there are a number of assumptions when we say that. The number of assumptions. For example, the first assumption is that no lockdown equals massive spreading of the virus. Waiting for just scientific proof of that. The second assumption is that you know, then overwhelming of the hospital, etc. All this chain of assumptions are debatable. What is not debatable is the population at risk, so the weakest that are now identified. That is something that we know very well, so we can do things politically on that. Apart from these people, all people with comorbidities, the question is very open to know whether doing this or that changes anything or changes slightly. We've done some research which shows that maybe the lockdown had a bit of influence positively, but it's very, very small, like maximum 10%. So I think it's very important to differentiate the what we know strongly from what we don't know strongly. Regarding the day by day, it doesn't mean that if there is one blink one day, it means that we have to, change everything. Of course, there's a fitting of all these curves. It's just we need to have some gaps opening and constantly opening, not opening one day, to say that probably something weird is happening.
So the premise on which our welfare states were built was to provide a safety net for the most vulnerable in our population. And they could be vulnerable because of disease. They could be vulnerable because of old age. They could be vulnerable because they come from broken homes. It's because of the way life works, bad luck, etc. So coming out of World War II, we built welfare states on the premise of protecting the most vulnerable. Here we seem to have made a big jump from protecting the most vulnerable to protecting everybody, to saying, look, our governments are not here to protect the most vulnerable, they're here to protect and shelter absolutely everybody. Can we afford that?
No, it does not make...
It's one thing to protect the weakest, but protecting everyone is pretty costly.
First, we all know that it does not make sense because it's always at the expense of something else. And it's even more than an economic question, it's a question of justice. So there was this theory of justice by John Rawls, which is an excellent book, probably the best book written on the notion of justice. And he mentioned the fact that in a modern society, a humanist society, one of the rules was to let some people get rich, some other, less. That's the nature of the business. But all that could be only done if the poorest or fraction of the population, the weakest, was benefiting from growth. So it would be immoral to have some people getting very rich and then the weakest getting poorer. So that's the notion that you're mentioning, which is the protection of the poor. And the protection of the poor is not only a question of health, it's a question of humanity. If they cannot feed themselves, the society has to help them feed and find a way home and things like that. And that makes a lot of sense. The question, of course, is where do you put the threshold? If you say that the threshold of the weak of the population is whatever, 10, 15, 20%, you decide, that's fair enough. We can afford that. But if you start saying that the threshold is 99.9% of the population, this is over. It doesn't work anymore. So it's more than a health question. I think it's a question of justice in the way the theory of justice can be built with the competition between, of course, the selfish interest and the collective interest. And we've gone from something which was relatively well thought to an opinion which is very sympathetic, try to save everybody, which doesn't work in practice. And therefore, which can have consequences which are the exact opposite to the initial intention.
On that note, I liked your distinction between Catholic and Protestant countries. And I say this as, a practicing Catholic myself. It is interesting that the relationship to money in Catholic countries is obviously very different to the relationship with money in Protestant countries. And it seems that the Catholic countries, you showed the polls in Ireland, but France and Spain and Italy have embraced this sort of confinement for the greater good of the community, perhaps much better than Protestant countries or culturally Protestant countries like the US, like Germany, like Switzerland, like Sweden, etc. I found that distinction interesting, which brings me to the last question we have. When you talk about fragility, should Argentina do well? Is Argentina just permanently fragile because of its history of stress, its history of loss? Or as a major food producer, are they better now positioned into COVID-19 given the dislocations we're seeing in the food chain all over the world? Now, I think it's, I'm asking the question. Feel free to say that you haven't followed Argentina
No. I will let you answer this question, but I will add something about the Protestant and the Catholic and their cultural relation to money. If I want to be caricatural, I would say that Protestants makes money. It's a benediction from God. But if a Catholic makes money, some people always think that it's probably because he has stolen this money from someone else. So that's the first thing, is that culturally, the relation to money is different in the Catholic and Protestant world, culturally. And the second thing is the relationship or the relation to the states. The Protestant, they are, how can I say, they are not distrustful vis-a-vis the state, but they are very fond of their own freedom. So they will not give away this freedom, easily. When in the Catholic world, it's not like this. We have a relationship to the state which is different. Now on the question of Argentina, I'll let you answer that.
To be honest, I haven't looked at Argentina in a while, so I'm gonna pass on this one as well. And so on this, I'll end it here. I want to thank everybody for participating. Obviously, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to Didier. If you want to receive Didier's writings, feel free to reach out to Didier, to your sales guide, and myself, to any one of your contacts at GAFCAL. And thank you again, Didier, for participating in this today. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.